Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, and a former health commissioner here in Baltimore. Our goal is to bring evidence and experience to illuminate critical public health issues. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. Today, a special episode on a landmark event in environmental health, the contamination of Love Canal. Dr. Josh Sharfstein speaks to Keith O'Brien, author of a new book entitled Paradise Falls, The True Story of an Environmental Catastrophe. Let's listen.
Keith O'Brien, thanks so much for joining me on Public Health on Call to talk about your book about Love Canal. Now, I knew a little about Love Canal until I opened your book, and then I couldn't put it down. Tell us what the story's about.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Josh. I think for a great many people, Love Canal is a term that is familiar and suggestive of a disaster, but most people have forgotten what happened there. And what Love Canal was one of the great environmental and public health disasters of the 20th century. It is the story of a working class neighborhood on the east side of Niagara Falls that, unbeknownst to the residents, was built around an old canal in the 1950s. And this canal in the decade prior had been filled with roughly 20,000 tons of chemical waste and residue. And the city of Niagara Falls acquired this canal from the chemical company. It built a school on this land, and around this school grew a neighborhood. And, it took about 20 years for the problems to manifest themselves in ways that could not be ignored. But, really, the problems began much sooner.
So I want to just talk for a second. I want to go back a little bit in time, but when you say those problems manifesting themselves, it's really amazing to read. I mean, what people who lived in that area actually experienced. Could you explain?
Absolutely. So in the homes closest to the old canal, in the homes closest to this school, there were significant problems. Chemicals leached through the walls of basements, chemicals pooled in the backyards. These chemicals at times were strong enough that there was a notable odor and other problems. In one particular house near the canal, these puddling chemicals actually ate away at a wooden fence. Small mammals, in other words, pets who lived in the neighborhood, suffered significant problems, cancers, rashes, loss of fur. And children also noted problems in this neighborhood, going way back before some of these much more obvious problems, way back into the 1950s and early 1960s. So 15 years before the problems would manifest in ways that residents could not ignore. Children who went to school on that land and played on the playground on that land reported burns on their skin and their eyes. And in fact, Josh, even reported rocks that would spontaneously combust, rocks that would burst into flames. And I want to be very clear here. The residents and the children called them rocks. And in particular, they called them fire rocks. But these were not rocks. Rocks don't catch on fire. These were congealed clumps of chemical waste that reacted to the environment around it.
So it's astonishing, the nature of the problems, but your book is not a chemistry textbook. It's not documenting each of the different chemicals that were in these drums that were just below the surface. It doesn't talk about, in great detail at least, how chemicals migrate around or combine. It's a story of people. And in particular, you tell the story of two groups of people: the residents who were there, who were becoming aware of these problems, and the people who work with the residents. That's on one hand. And on the other hand, the people who were, in theory, responsible for protecting their health, the health officials at every level, all the way up to the federal government. Could you set the stage for this sort of battle that became the Battle of Love Canal?
Absolutely. So this old canal filled with chemical waste was one of the best kept secrets in town. However, it was known by people in power in Niagara Falls. For decades, health officials in Niagara Falls, city officials in Niagara Falls, company executives in Niagara Falls were well aware of the extent of the dumping and the extent of the danger in the city. The residents, however, were not. And when problems begin to manifest in the late 1970s, 1977, 1978, it is primarily residents, and in particular, mothers, housewives, as they were known at the time, who pushed this issue into the spotlight and refused to be ignored. They were understandably worried about the chemicals in the ground and what it might be doing to their children. And to be fair to public health officials in the state of New York and also at the federal government, they were concerned too. And one of the first things that the state of New York does in conjunction with the federal government in August 1978 is at first recommend evacuation for about 200 families living closest to the old canal, and then within a matter of just a couple of days, overrule themselves and order this evacuation. Again, for about 200 families. These were the homes closest to that rectangular piece of land, closest to the school. And that allowed those families to recoup the loss of their house and move away. But, residents living on the edge of that first evacuation zone were sometimes connected by a yard or looking across the street at a house that was now abandoned and wondering to themselves and then out loud, how could it be possible that that house 30 feet away is unsafe, but mine is safe? And they began to push for answers. And, the public health officials in the state of New York in particular found themselves in a particular vise, under pressure from residents to determine the extent of the danger, but also under political pressure not to spend any more money scooping up homes in a working class neighborhood in Niagara Falls. And again, to be fair to the public health officials, it was very difficult to say where the problems began and where they ended.
Well, I, first of all, appreciate you're trying to be fair to the public health officials, but I think as we should be fair to everyone, but the story should be told, including the criticism. The people who live there were not, by and large, particularly well educated, and they figured this out for themselves, and they were often dismissed for being poorly educated, and that became a source of ongoing friction.
That's absolutely true. And I do think that public health officials underestimated the residents and the force of will among the residents. You mentioned, this is a working class neighborhood. These were factory workers' families. These were union workers' families. These were families that were scraping their way to the middle class. These were starter homes. All of these homes were ranchers. They were single-story homes. And then just on the downtown side of the canal, just on the western side of the canal, was a 300-unit public housing development, which was roughly 60% Black at the time. And all of these residents collectively were underestimated and dismissed. But in particular, the residents living in that public housing development were dismissed and forgotten, especially in the early months of this crisis.
Today, we would call this citizen science.
Absolutely.
Where people really figure out what's happening in their own lives and where their lack of formal education doesn't stop them. They did have some help, and you tell the story of a particular scientist from a local research agency who tries to cross that line between the people living in Love Canal and all the health officials who were eventually grappling with what to do.
Yeah, you're referencing a woman by the name of Beverly Pagan. Beverly was a PhD level biologist who did not live in this neighborhood. Beverly lived about 25 minutes away in Buffalo. And she was a researcher at a lab that was connected with the University at Buffalo there. And Beverly had spent the 1970s specifically focused on environmental risk factors. She was studying the risks, say, that air pollution pose to human health, or the risks, say, that cigarette smoking pose to human health. And so when this environmental health crisis emerges just 25 minutes from her house, of course, Beverly wants to go out there and run her own tests and work with the residents there. And she does that in the summer of 1978, just as these problems are emerging and just as the state of New York orders that first evacuation. But Beverly becomes convinced quite early on that state health officials are undershooting the risk factors in the neighborhood and underplaying them. And she at first mentions this privately to public health officials in Albany, and then publicly. And when she does that, Beverly Pagan is putting her own self at risk because she worked for a lab that was affiliated with the University at Buffalo. She was effectively a state employee, and her ultimate superiors were not the administrators at the lab at the University of Buffalo. They were the top public health officials in Albany. And so when she begins to contradict what they're saying, she begins to pay a price for that.
I think that was one of the hardest things for me as a former state health official to read, was the way in which the state health department pushed her around, criticized her, and also lumped her in with basically their view of people who didn't know what they were talking about, which is how they unfortunately treated the people who were living in Love Canal. And in meeting after meeting, they're saying they don't know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're talking about. And now this person who obviously is also very well trained, she doesn't know what she's talking about. And incredibly, even after that initial, response that you talked about, it takes months and then years for definitive resolution. I mean, I couldn't believe your book was so long. I was like, okay, they figured it out pretty quickly and they're going to buy up all the homes. And it just goes on and on and on. And to me, two things really broke through that impasse. The impasse created by the arrogance, I think, and stubbornness and, failure to really look at the data by the health officials. One of them was a series of hearings in Washington by a young congressman from Tennessee.
That's right. In March of 1979, about 9 months after these problems have emerged, and a full, by the way, 14 months before they'll ultimately be resolved, a young congressman from Tennessee by the name of Al Gore invites Dr. Beverly Pagan, the PhD level biologist from Buffalo, and one of the mothers from the neighborhood, a woman named Lois Gibbs, to come and testify before his subcommittee in Congress. And it's a stunning thing to go back and reread. Al Gore was one of the youngest congressmen in Washington at the time, and he was not particularly proven as a politician. In fact, most people sort of thought he had gotten there by way of nepotism. In fact, he had replaced his own father in Washington. And Gore is not a lawyer. He's a former journalist with some military experience. But when you go back and reread the hearing transcripts that he runs or helps run in the spring of 1979, he does two things. First, he listens to Lois Gibbs, the mother from 101st Street, and he listens to Beverly Pagan, the biologist. And then as they call other witnesses, including current and former employees from the chemical company in Niagara Falls and the top public health official from the state of New York, Dr. David Axelrod, he parries with them and absolutely dismantles their reasoning, sometimes in the span of just a few minutes. And it is really the first time that a national politician has listened to these residents, and it gives them a certain prominence that will push them forward and ultimately get them what they want, which is to escape their own neighborhood.
The story that you tell, and we can't go into all the details, involves the governor of New York, the president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, senior officials, a member of Congress who represented the district. And over this enormously long period of time, when, as you're reading it, you're practically screaming at your book, buy the houses already. It just goes on and on and on. Everybody has their own agendas. And, the other major thing that struck me was, and I won't say it any other way, a kind of a hostage situation that developed, which, was kind of a plot twist. I did not know this part of the Love Canal story at all.
Yeah, in May of 1980, backed into a corner, feeling that no one was ultimately going to listen to them unless they did something radical. Lois Gibbs, the mother from 101st Street, and a couple other mothers from the neighborhood hold hostage 2 agents from the Environmental Protection Agency over the course of about 6 hours inside the Homeowners Association office there, just on the edge of the old canal. These women were not armed. They were not going to harm the men in any way, but they also wouldn't let them go. And a large crowd did gather outside that maybe might have harmed the men. And, it's the sort of thing that if residents did today, regardless of their gender or their race, they would be held accountable. There would be charges in a post 9/11, post January 6th world. But in 1980, when a few white housewives hold a couple of EPA agents hostage, it didn't end that way. Instead, it did directly get the attention of President Jimmy Carter. And within 36 hours, he ordered the evacuation of the entire neighborhood, anybody who wanted to leave, and ultimately cleared the path to purchase those homes.
Yeah, it really had the effect of you can't make this up at that point in the book.
It's so true. It was very, the 70s, I think you can appreciate, Josh, is a time that feels relatively close to many of us. And yet it is history. It is 50 years ago in many cases. And the world was decidedly different and much rawer in many ways.
So let's talk about the legacy of Love Canal this many years later. As you look around, there is more appreciation, perhaps, of environmental justice than there was back then. There is an appreciation of the way certain communities are taking on a huge burden of chemical exposure. But there's also some countervailing trends. What do you think the people of Love Canal, where they're all around today, would look around and say?
It's a mixed legacy, Josh. On the one hand, Love Canal and the reaction of the residents who lived in that neighborhood did create a roadmap for that citizen science and that citizen activism that you mentioned before, and really did inspire other working class and middle class people around the country. In 1978, 1979, 1980, the environmental movement was still considered to be this sort of fringe liberal movement, something that East Coast elites or West Coast hippies might pursue, as they would have said at the time. The reaction of these working class mothers in Niagara Falls changed that and really did push people around the country to think about their own backyards in a different way, and did lead to real policy changes at the federal government level, specifically the creation of what we call and know as the Superfund Act, which gives the federal government the ability to go in and clean up these kind of sites. However, just as the chemical company in question here was incredibly powerful in the 1970s and early 1980s, and just as that company did everything it could to protect itself, that still happens today in communities around the country today who are grappling with similar kinds of environmental problems and also new ones. I think a lot of your listeners will have heard of PFAS, this so-called forever chemicals that are poisoning our drinking water, poisoning the soil in many places, poisoning rivers and lakes. This is a new challenge that many communities are facing today. And just one example of how Love Canal hasn't changed as much as the residents at the time might have hoped.
Well, I think that one way to break free from the problems of the past is to understand them. And your book is just such a terrific contribution to that effort. Thanks so much for joining me to talk about it today.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinell, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Holes Fernandez and Amber Bryan Singletary. Thank you for listening.